You're listening to a 58 Ember production.
GIRLSCAMP, it's Girls Camp.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Girls Camp podcast. I'm your host, Haley Rawl, and if you are navigating a faith deconstruction too, or simply fascinated by faith deconstruction journeys, by Mormonism specifically and religion generally, then you are in the right place. It is the first Wednesday of the month. Happy October. That means that we are doing a campfire chat. I have an excellent list of submissions that we're going to be going through today. We've got questions, inquiries for advice, and some stories thrown in there as well. So that's what we're doing today. But I also need to talk about the fact that I was a guest on Dr. Phil Primetime, Dr. Phil's new rebranded show, Dr. Phil Primetime, and I want to share a little behind the scenes and some thoughts and feelings about that whole ordeal. I actually did a really thorough rundown of the whole Dr. Phil experience on the Patreon. So if you're interested in that, patreon.com/girlscamp. I did an episode on that on Sunday. I got a lot of questions about behind the scenes details like wardrobe and things like that. And I cover all of that on the Patreon, but I just wanted to give some general impressions and just give you a feel for how this all went down. I actually got reached out to way back in February and went through somewhat of a casting process. I was told that Dr. Phil was going to be doing a panel on the decline of religion in America. So I went through the casting process, got casted, and then was on a plane about a week and a half after getting casted to go do the taping in Texas. If you've seen the show, then you know that the whole experience was a little bit crazy. I actually think watching it back, it was crazier in some ways than I remembered. And what I mean by that is I was told that it was going to be not even a debate, but kind of a friendly conversation, that there might be some back and forth. I know Dr. Phil, his whole shtick is these high controversy, high conflict things. So I was a little bit skeptical when they were telling me that, but I also wasn't all that nervous about it because I feel like I'm always up for a good debate, especially about religion, this kind of topic. But they kind of sold it to me as you are just going to go and share your personal experience. There will be religious people on this panel and ex-religious people as well. And so that is all I really knew showing up to the taping. After going through hair and wardrobe and all those things the day of the taping, I was walked into the studio. There's an in-studio audience. And just immediately, I kind of was like, oh, this is the vibe. Like the vibe already, and maybe I was just projecting, felt not necessarily antagonistic, but I kind of just got the feeling most of these people, because they're showing up to a Dr. Phil taping, are probably pretty conservative Christian. I mean, who's to say? But that was kind of the vibe I got. And I already, just walking into that room, had this feeling of, oh, I'm the bad guy to these people. I'm that crazy agnostic person that it was almost like I got to see myself how I would have seen myself back when I was a devout Mormon. And all of those things I would have thought about who I am now, I was kind of feeling all of that at once. And then I sit down, the intro sequence begins, and seriously, please watch it because it's hard to describe how nutty it was. Just the approach was so clearly biased towards religion. I actually learned only a few days before taping how conservative Christian Dr. Phil himself is. And I did a little research. I hadn't been keeping tabs on Dr. Phil. The last time I had thought of him was years and years ago. And when I saw Dr. Phil, the casting person, in my DMs, I was like, oh yeah, Dr. Phil, he just does those weird like paternity test and paternity disputes and family dramas. Like that's what I knew of Dr. Phil. I hadn't really been paying much attention and, had only seen some things here and there way back when I was a teenager. I did have some people when I announced that I went on the Dr. Phil show who were a little bit upset that I was on this man's platform, which I can entirely understand. I certainly do not align with or endorse any of Dr. Phil's views, probably mostly none of them. I didn't think, maybe I was being naive, I didn't feel like it was problematic for me to go on his show, particularly because I was being asked to come essentially debate against him and against his beliefs. And so I thought it would be clear that I don't endorse him or his beliefs, but it felt worth it because he does have such a huge platform. And I think especially because that platform is so catered toward it is toward conservative Christian people. So I felt like it was a very unique opportunity to say my piece in front of an audience that is normally not listening to people like us. And I also think it's really important because there is a huge divide between people who are believers in Jesus Christ and in God, and people who are agnostic or deconstructed Christians or ex-Mormons. I think that there's a huge bridge of misunderstanding. And I've talked about this before. My main goal on Girls Camp is not necessarily to bridge that gap, but I think it's a wonderful bonus. And I thought it was a good opportunity. The pushback I got, which I will say, I think most people were excited I got this opportunity, and thank you for being excited for me. But the pushback I got was just people saying like, yeah, again, this is a problematic person and here you are in a photo with him, things like that. Like I said, I can understand that. I definitely think that a line needs to be drawn at some point between platforming problematic people or even engaging with or participating with problematic people. Dr. Phil just never struck me, or I guess I just hadn't spent all that much time thinking about Dr. Phil beyond just thinking like, yeah, he thinks very differently than me. He's probably done some exploitative things, but I guess I just didn't feel like he was beyond that line of being worth engaging with and saying my side of things. After kind of having conversations with people in my DMs about Dr. Phil, one of the big, really problematic things he's done, which I did not know, is he has sent a lot of teenagers to the teen troubled youth, I'm using air quotes when I say that, facilities that were essentially torturing teenagers. And I was actually talking with a listener in the DMs, and she was really passionate about this topic because her husband has been sent to one of those camps and just has like awful trauma, as you can imagine, from it. So I was really bummed out to hear that, and obviously do not support that whatsoever. I think it does get complicated just, again, to find that line. And I don't regret going on the Dr. Phil show. I maybe would have presented it a little bit differently, having known some of that stuff about sending those teenagers to those camps and things like that. But after watching the show, once it aired, I think it's pretty clear for anyone who watched, I was not there to say, rah, rah, go Dr. Phil. I was there to push back against what I think can be very divisive and limiting perspective from conservative Christians toward anyone else who's not that. I was really nervous to watch myself on TV. I can't imagine people who go on big reality TV shows, how nerve-wracking that would be. I mean, Dr. Phil is not necessarily my target demographic, the audience watching that, but just being on TV and not having control over how you're edited and not knowing what you look like or if you did or said anything embarrassing. I was just really nervous to watch it. But after watching it, I was proud of myself. I hope that's not, I don't know. I'm trying to be better at just saying I'm proud of myself when I am, because I think we should all be better at that. And I am mostly proud that I was not intimidated by Dr. Phil and by the people on the religious side of the panel, because there was a lot of things that were said that I think were really condescending, that I think were really reductive to our worldview as the people on the ex-religious side of things. I feel like I stood my ground as best I could, and I'm glad that I did that. It was really hard to get a word in edgewise. This maybe showed in the edit, but there was so many people on the panel. the whole way that it was structured was just kind of bizarre and didn't lend itself, in my opinion, to the best type of back and forth conversation. I would have done it very differently were I producing it, I guess is what I'm saying. But I also can see that they wanted a variety of religious and ex-religious perspectives. I mean, I can understand why they did it, but it was kind of tricky to get my thoughts and feelings in there. So I'm glad that I did when I did. I'm glad I had the opportunity to say what I felt needed to be said. And I hope you enjoyed it. And I hope I did you proud if you watched. I really do. I just feel so passionately. Obviously, I'm actually coming off of, I just read a Facebook comment I got. My Instagram will post automatically to Facebook, which is really scary. I keep forgetting to fix that because Facebook is where I have like all my mission people, my mission president, just people I met on my mission, members, or people we taught on the mission. There's also just more extended family following me there. So it's a little bit of a less welcoming environment to my post-Mormon thoughts. And anyway, I got this comment from someone who I had known a little bit on my mission, someone who was American but was living in Germany and was a member in one of the wards that I was in as a missionary. And the message was on the post I made about being on Dr. Phil. And it was just so full of all of these misconceptions, I think, that people have about those of us who are either post-Mormon specifically or ex-religious generally. And it was crazy how triggered I felt because I'm not normally that triggered by those types of messages just because I'm really used to it. But I think it was because she hit like almost every checkbox of the kinds of things religious people will say to people like us, basically saying you're miserable and you're dedicating your whole life to being negative about something. That's one that I really hate. She said, "Why didn't you just stay in the church and fix it from the inside?" She was trying to tell me about all the wonderful things that the church does. And it was funny because that was all after her first sentence, which was, "I respect you on your journey and everyone deserves their own journey, but." And I found it triggering, but I also was thinking as I read that, this is why I went on the show, is because so many of us deal with this kind of shit and it's bullshit. I really just want it to be known that people who don't even believe in God anymore, believe it or not, we are still good, moral people. And it's insane that that has to be said. It's insane that people think that if you don't believe in God, you're a terrible person, but a lot of people do. And yes, Dr. Phil is problematic and his platform is in some ways, but he was willing to host that conversation, though from a very biased point of view and probably a somewhat biased edit. But whenever we can kind of like get our foot in those doors, not whenever, but sometimes I feel like it's, again, worth it. Let's jump into the campfire chat submissions. Someone asks, what do you think about Mormon missions versus study abroads or other shorter term living abroad experiences? How much are Mormon missionaries, quote, living in the place they proselytize in? Are they pretty isolated from normal day-to-day life / activities? This is a really interesting question. I think about this a lot as someone who didn't love the mission aspect of my mission, but really, really valued the cultural experience, the worldview expanding experience of living in another country and living there for a good amount of time, 18 months. Do I think shorter term things like study abroad, etc., are similar? Yes. I think that those good things about a mission can be replicated without all of the bad things of a mission. The thing with a mission that is so unique is that it's longer, so you really are integrated into the culture and community in a different way. Not that that's impossible otherwise, but I do think it's a unique way. But there's so many other ways. I mean, this person mentioned study abroad. Something that I've thought a lot about that I might encourage my kids to do if they're interested is doing something like going to be an au pair or a live-in nanny. The reason that comes to mind for me is because when I was on my mission in Germany, I met a handful of American au pairs who had flown to Germany, and they were there for a year being a live-in nanny. That is a super integrated living abroad experience, a chance to learn the language, to see the family culture up close, just to live somewhere for that amount of time. So I definitely think that it can be replicated, but I think what this person more was asking is, do I feel like I got the experience of culture and those sorts of things living in Germany as a missionary, or was I just so much a missionary that I didn't really get to participate in all of that? And I think a little bit of both. I definitely feel like I got a really good feel for Germany because I got to see a variety of places in Germany. I got to meet so many different people there. As a missionary, you're forced to get out and meet people and be out and about. And so I do think that there was a lot of those touch points, but there's obviously a huge side of things that you don't touch at all, namely recreation. I never went on a hike. We could see like landmarks and things like that on the one off day of the week. So there was some of that. But as far as recreation, going to the zoo, going to malls, I guess I did go to malls on my day off for a couple hours at a time. So yes and no, you get a little bit of that, but you don't get the whole thing. I feel really lucky that I've been able to go back to Germany, and I definitely felt like it was a different experience not being a missionary. And I have not gone back to Germany as an ex-Mormon, and I'm dying to go because, I mean, a big part of German culture is alcohol, for example. I think it'd be so fun to be able to drink alcohol in Germany. I know Berlin has an incredible party scene. I think it'd be really fun to go party a little bit in Germany. Those things are obviously very off limits for missionaries. So I'm looking forward to eventually making my way back to Berlin specifically. I have a dream of getting some mission friends back together because I have a lot of mission friends who have left the church, and going back to Germany and just being able to do all of that. I think that would be so fun and just kind of the best sort of fuck you to the church to be able to go back and reclaim that experience altogether. So who knows, maybe someday. Okay, next write-in. This person says, I'm a never Mormon, raised by a dad who was partially Mormon, raised in the church until he was 8 years old. You'd be surprised, well, probably not actually, about how deep-rooted that guilt goes. I have so much Mormon family from my dad's 2 older sisters, and I recently saw a few of the cousins my age have stopped wearing garment-friendly clothes and stopped posting about the church. I want to ask them, but at the same time, I don't want to disrespect them if they're still practicing, but not outwardly showing it. I'm just so curious. Also, I've never really been allowed to be close to them because up until my brother passed, they thought we were terrible people because we weren't raised Mormon. And they started getting close to us after his passing and literally told us, wow, you guys are actually such nice people. After listening to your show for so long, I know now they were taught to think we weren't good people. Advice! Exclamation point, exclamation point, exclamation point. Those backhanded compliments that say so much. Oh, you actually are a really nice person. It's like, thanks, I guess. What a weird thing to be told. As far as how to approach this, I feel like my rule of thumb is to let people come to you to talk about their faith deconstruction. Just because even if someone is pretty fully out of the church, it's such a different thing to be out of the church and then to be willing to talk about it with people. And even though you're probably such a safe person for them to talk about it with, they might just not be ready. And I like to think about ways you can signify that you're open to that conversation without just being like, yo, are you out of the church? And I don't know, it might be little things like just sharing a post-Mormon something or other on your Instagram story, or just letting them know that you are kind of in that realm, like thinking about those types of things, I think can sometimes signal to people like, oh, I could maybe talk to this person about this thing. It would be really interesting to have that conversation as a never Mormon, never been Mormon, but obviously you're connected in some ways, but didn't have as much of that conditioning growing up, I think it'd be really fascinating to talk to them. I can absolutely relate to this experience where in my extended family, mostly on Bentley's side, because all of mine are mostly still in the church, but there were a handful of cousins of Bentley's, even siblings of his, that after we left the church, we just connected with them so deeply and kind of had to be like, whoa, we didn't feel like we were distancing ourselves from you in any conscious way, but subconsciously there was definitely a wedge there, a divide there, that now that we've left the church, it's just really, really special and cool to not have that anymore and to kind of have the opposite thing where it's like, oh, I'm sorry that I was conditioned to think this way and that I fell for it. So that could be a really healing and special conversation to have with them. And I also love your perspective on this because sounds like they were pretty shitty and have been kind of shitty with some of the things that they've said, but it sounds like you're just happy for them for deconstructing and want to be there for them. And I think that that's a sign of really great character. And I hope that you get to connect on that soon. Next question. Have you watched Big Love on HBO? It's from 2010, I think, and it's mostly focused on the polygamy stuff of the FLDS, but they show a lot of the Mormon side of things. It seems accurate based on what I know from your podcast, but I'm curious about your thoughts. I did not watch Big Love. I remember there being a huge uproar in the Mormon community about Big Love, especially because they showed the temple clothing. I don't think they showed the full ritual, but I do remember that there was temple clothing shown in a temple scene. And I just thought back in 2010, how old would I have been? 15-ish? I remember thinking that was so bad and wrong that the show had temple clothing in it. I didn't even know what the temple clothing looked like at that point. I had never been through the temple at that point, but I heard adults around me talking about it and just thought, that's so awful and so disrespectful. I should watch the show. I'm really curious about it. I've heard good things. I've heard it's a good show. And I actually, not that I don't know anything about the FLDS and that community, but I could definitely learn more, and that would be a good place to start. So I am adding it to my list. Okay, next submission. Someone says, I related way too much to Jen's situation with Zach on the Secret Lives of Mormon Wives, and it sent me in a spiral the last couple of weeks. That's really tough. I was actually thinking as I was watching that play out, how many women were maybe seeing themselves in that situation and thinking, oh shit, I can relate. Not that I am glad that Jen has had to experience that. And if you haven't watched the show, in a very small nutshell, there's a character, a cast member in the Secret Lives of Mormon Wives, and she has a pretty textbook verbally abusive partner. And not just that, but a verbally abusive partner who also uses the church and worthiness standards of the church against her. So I'm imagining that's what this person is relating to. I'm not glad that Jen has ever had to experience that. I hope it's a powerful awakening for women in that experience. And I hope that watching that play out the way it did on TV and seeing people's responses to it, not only on the show, but also people commenting on the show, that people in that situation realize that that is not okay and that you should never be treated that way. And that is abuse. I think something that happens in Mormon marriages, but also in ex-Mormon marriages, is that you don't really have a very good standard of what a healthy marriage looks like, because I think a lot of Mormon marriages are quite dysfunctional for many reasons, because people get married young, because of the patriarchal messaging, all of those things. I think that it can be confusing if you are just having marital problems that people have, struggling to communicate, struggling to, make it work with co-parenting, just things that anybody would deal with. I think that because so many Mormon marriages are dysfunctional, that abusive marriages are harder to detect as someone in one. And I think that marriage, and I still feel this way hugely as an ex-Mormon, I am so, of all the things, probably the one thing that I get most nervous about is how my marriage is perceived. And when I talk about the things that Bentley and I have been through, or when I talk about things that relate to my marriage, I get so nervous about it because I think that the worst thing it feels in a lot of ways still to me outside of the Mormon framework is to have a difficult marriage. And I think that that creates a lot of shame for people in opening up about their marriage problems. When I interviewed my friend Gabby Wright, who was in a physically abusive marriage, she said she would kind of try and breadcrumb to people like, yeah, like this happens with my husband, like kind of trying to figure out like, is this normal? And when we're not able to have those really frank, honest conversations about what's going on with people, then you get further isolated into the abuse. And this is not coming from a place of experience. I haven't been in an abusive marriage, but I think that in the LDS culture, and also as an ex-LDS person, it would just be more difficult in a lot of ways. And the divorce thing is just really tricky. I can't imagine if you find yourself in that position when you're young, maybe this person has kids, maybe they don't. That's just a really hard thing. And I'm really sorry. I do know that no one deserves to be treated that way. And I also know that unfortunately, it's really difficult for people who are narcissists to change. And even if people who are narcissists or even narcissistic, even if they want to change really badly, that is still a really long road. And I'm imagining you're young-ish, or even if you're not, I mean, who cares? I just hate to see a woman dedicating so much of their lives to fixing a fucked up man. I just think that you deserve to live your life for you and not trying to fix this other person. Obviously, that gets complicated when kids are involved, when finances are involved. But I hope you don't feel alone because I think this is unfortunately a problem. And I hope that you can find people in your life that you can talk about this with. And I think that is a huge, huge thing that will help. I've seen marriages like that in my own spheres, and it's really devastating. But I'm glad that you got some awareness around it and that, you know, watching that show, say what you will about reality TV, everyone, I think that might have been a big moment for a lot of people in a similar way. Next submission. Someone says, I'm currently deconstructing the Mormon church and with it, my beliefs about Jesus. I admire him as a spiritual teacher and example, but I no longer feel sure about the doctrine of the atonement. My partner feels that the atonement is absolutely necessary to satisfy justice and that someone must, quote, pay the price to right our wrongs. He used an example of a man who committed murder. The man can do everything in his power to make amends within himself and to others, but he can never restore the life which he took. He argues that only the power of the atonement could completely restore the harm done to the deceased and his family. I tried to argue that not every wrong needs to be corrected and that sometimes bad things are just a part of life, but I couldn't make a convincing argument as to why the atonement is not needed. What are your thoughts on justice and the atonement? I loved this question because this got me thinking a lot. Believing that there needs to be an atonement believes that there is some sort of cosmic sense of justice that something can even balance, right? I don't think that that itself is true. So that whole paradigm or view of the world or the universe, I guess in this case, I just don't think is real. When we're looking at the instance of a person who potentially murdered someone, I believe that if someone murdered someone and wanted to work through their shame and their guilt and go to prison and live the rest of their life trying to make it better, that's better for that person than just happily being a murderer. I don't think regardless of what that murderer does, it's going to change the fact that they murdered someone. And I don't think that some supernatural being like Jesus Christ can also change any of that. I don't think that if someone is murdered, that there's anything that can make that just or anything that can make that fair. It's just unfair. And I think that's why a lot of people gravitate towards believing in something like the atonement, is because that's a really hard pill to swallow, that there's just a lot of shit that's really unfair and there's nothing to make up for it, because how could it, right? Like, you look at the atonement and someone might say, well, Christ paid the price for that sin. Even if that's true, that doesn't mean the family is still going to have to deal with all of that grief and pain and loss. That doesn't mean that that person's life was taken from them. So it's such an abstract concept anyway, that I don't think it really, in a tangible way, does create any sort of justice. I don't know what you believe about the afterlife, but also the atonement only feels necessary to me if you have a religious framework that suggests that people who do terrible things, in order for them to live in heaven again, the price has to be paid for the terrible things that they've done. But I don't believe that either. So if there's a murderer, I think that murderer dies and then they're gone. So I don't think that there's someone who needs to step in to fix or to atone for the sins, because I just don't think anything, at least that traditional heaven-hell thing, I don't think it pans out that way anyway, which also kind of makes that unnecessary. I was thinking about this question because I was gathering these submissions last night, and I had a no-nonsense spirituality Britt Hartley TikTok pop up on my For You page. My TikTok must be reading my notes app. Genuinely, I'm like, whoa, this is weird. But I loved this TikTok. I'll link it in the show notes. Britt was essentially saying that the atonement is patterned after ancient rituals of human sacrifice. And in more ancient times, people would sacrifice animals or other humans. And it was this community process of working through guilt and shame. And the atonement now is another way for people to work through guilt and shame. So if you make a mistake, you feel bad about it, then you can pray to Jesus, call on the atonement, which is a human sacrifice, and then that can give you some sort of peace or processing of the guilt and shame. And she made this really interesting point where she was saying that she has a grandma, I believe it was, who was kind of a terrible person, was a neglectful mother. And one day, this grandma said to Britt, yeah, I used to have a lot of guilt and shame about how I was as a mother, but then I prayed about it and asked Jesus to take it away through the atonement, and now I'm at peace. But that grandma has still not apologized to her children for the harm that she caused. And Britt was just pointing out that it's actually more difficult to work through and process guilt and shame outside of the framework of an atonement because it requires resources and work. And so the atonement for some can provide almost an easier path because it's a way of processing guilt and shame by simply saying like, hey, Jesus, take this away from me. And if you believe in Jesus enough, then that can maybe remove the heaviness of the guilt or can, make you feel better because you do believe that there was a sacrifice done, a ritual performed that you can now hearken to feel better about yourself. I thought that was just such a fascinating perspective on the atonement. For some reason, I've never connected the dots of the human sacrifice thing. And I was like, oh yeah, no shit. But I think it also speaks to, again, just one thing that I find tricky about believing in something like the atonement is that, is it really working through guilt and shame? Or is it kind of an out? And, who's to say? I know there's plenty of people who I think would say, I repent and it gives me peace and it makes me want to be a better person the next day. And that's great. I've always found the atonement incredibly ambiguous and difficult to actually implement into my life. So that could also be a helpful resource for you to look at when debating with your partner. And sorry, these types of debates can be really exhausting. So I'm sorry you feel like you have to plead your case in that instance, but good for you and your partner for discussing these types of things. Next question. Okay, am I in the wrong here? I love that intro for a question. I saw one of my best friends from high school for the first time in years. I am a straight female that is married, and he is a gay man that is single. We took a photo together of us hugging, and my husband got so upset. He said I should only ever touch him that way and no other man, and it doesn't matter that he's gay. I see no issue with it whatsoever. Like when he brought it up, I was so confused what the problem was. He said we need to avoid the appearance of evil, and if people saw that, they would get the wrong idea. Help. Am I in the wrong here? It's also worth mentioning my husband is very in the church. His dad is a bishop and his mom is very LDS. He's definitely against gay rights, and I am so not. I'm actively going to church, but I do have my questions and doubts. This is a very easy one for me to answer. Are you in the wrong? No, not at all. I was a little bit trying to see your husband's side until the appearance of evil thing because, okay, let's back up a little bit. And I'm going to relate this back to the Secret Lives of Mormon Wives because I am thank God, not peak, but I am still in Secret Lives of Mormon Wives land somehow. But I was thinking about this with the Chippendales situation where some of the cast members went to a Chippendale show and some of their husbands were upset or partners and some of them weren't. And I was thinking about this balance between having a boundary and communicating in your partnership, like what is okay and what's not okay. And yes, there's part of me that thinks that, you have to have those conversations. And I guess there's part of me that thinks that if your partner says like, hey, it's a boundary for me that I don't want you in a photo hugging another man, regardless of their sexuality. Okay. But he didn't have that conversation with you. He just got mad at you after the fact. And you didn't have a chance to say, well, actually, I don't feel very comfortable about that boundary, or that boundary feels controlling. And also, now that I'm even using the word boundary, I might be using it wrong because I think it often gets misinterpreted. People think a boundary is saying like you can't hug another man, but a boundary is actually something that you can implement yourself. So I don't even know how a boundary would necessarily work around this, but maybe you could just have a relationship boundary where it's like, okay, I feel uncomfortable if you're in the car with someone of the opposite sex alone. Like that's something that you could talk about in your partnership. And the tricky part comes in where I'm like, okay, but if your partner's just being controlling and they just say like, well, this is how I feel, then I don't think that's healthy, nor do I think you have to just like do what your partner is comfortable with. Like you should both be on the same page, which requires communication, which requires your partner listen to you and hear your side and vice versa. I think that the way your partner reacted is particularly upsetting because they're using the quote appearance of evil thing. And it sounds like your partner is a lot more concerned about how that's going to look for other people than, mistrusting your intention and hugging your friend. And it also seems like he's homophobic. You said so yourself, and that's really shitty. And it sounds also just controlling. Like they're just feeling like they didn't control the situation. They can't control how you're perceived all the time. And now they're getting miffed about it. And I don't want to tell you your partner sucks, but like if your partner's against gay rights, they suck. I don't know what to tell you besides I just want to tell you that you're definitely not in the wrong. And hopefully you can help your partner understand that being against gay rights is literally not okay at all. Sorry if you just heard me shit on your partner for however long I did, but I'm going to say what I'm going to say. Next question. My dad passed away last year and my mom is already dating. She has been seeing this guy for 6 months. My sister and I have stopped talking to her because of this and she doesn't understand why. She is also a Molly Mormon and he is a never Mormon. She has been sleeping in the same bed with him and doing things she would never do with my dad. I am not Mormon anymore, but it still makes me so mad that she's breaking these rules that she made me do my whole life. It also makes me mad how fast she is moving on and how it feels like she didn't love my dad or do things for him like she is with this new guy. How can I deal with this? What should I do? I first want to say, valid times a million trillion. I think that this is a common sentiment. I have people in my spheres who have experienced the loss of a parent, and it's really hard when the living parent moves on quickly. It seems to happen somewhat commonly. Like, I feel like I've heard of this same sort of situation playing out. I wonder if it's a coping mechanism for your mom in a lot of ways. I don't know her backstory, but I can imagine, particularly if she was Mormon, that she's not used to being alone, having independence. So that maybe made it more appealing for her to just find someone else to kind of fill that gap. I can see how that would be absolutely frustrating, how it would feel hypocritical, and how you would be upset. I'm saying this as someone who, I obviously know this is easier said than done. And like, who knows? I'm basically saying like, I don't know if I would be able to do this in this situation, but I do think that everyone copes differently with death and with loss. And that doesn't justify bad behavior, but I would do my best to exercise compassion for your mom in this situation. As far as the Molly Mormonness of it all and her now not keeping these rules also would be incredibly frustrating. I think of, whenever I hear something like this, I think of the prodigal son thing in the opposite, where like, for example, I was Mormon for a longer time than some of my close friends, and I was annoying as fuck about it. And it's not like I was saying crazy things necessarily, but we would have conversations that I would push back. And then I left the church. And I'm really grateful that those people have never held that over me or never been like, oh, look, now you're smoking weed with us. Like, you know, you were defending Joseph Smith before and now here you are. I'm just grateful that they allowed me to change. And this may be particularly complicated with your mom because it sounds like she hasn't left Mormonism, but she's now just not doing all the Mormon things. But I think the best thing you can do is just not show judgment for those behaviors. If anything, I would see it as a win that maybe the church is loosening its hold on her. And I think that's really exciting. And it sounds like she's exercising newfound freedom that maybe she was hoping to with your dad, but didn't feel like she could. And that's hard too, because then maybe that brings up feelings brings up stuff for you around your dad. This is all massively complicated, and I think you absolutely deserve to feel the way that you do. But if you were my friend asking me, that's what I would say. And good luck, because grief is just so gnarly. And one of the hard things about grief that I've been thinking about since my grandma just died is how it's a pretty unique situation, because a lot of times the people that would be comforting you, they are also in grief. So like when my dad died, all my siblings were grieving. His siblings were grieving. My mom was grieving. And so it's like, wait, who takes care of who? Like, we all need to be taken care of. We all need to be cut slack. And my siblings and I, we actually had nothing crazy, but we had some arguments like in the week following his death, because we all just were sad and having a hard time and trying to take care of each other, but like also needing to be taken care of. And so that's one thing that's super hard about the death of a family member is normally you're relying on your family to comfort you, but they're also in the depths of it. And so it just creates really hard dynamics, I think. Someone wrote in and said, one of my best friends just had an affair. I have no one else to tell, so thanks for letting me tell you anonymously, smiley face. I wanted to extend that catharsis beyond you just typing that in and telling me to now this being somewhat publicly said on a podcast. Hopefully that feels extra cathartic, and good on you for not telling anyone and keeping your lips sealed. I can imagine it feels nice to let it out in an anonymous fashion like this. Next write-in. I decided to go to therapy to work through my religious reframing. I found a therapy group that took my insurance and put into a form that I needed a therapist comfortable working with religious transitions. My therapist was fine at first, but when we started getting into what I've been going through with religion, she told me that the church was true, that I was reading, quote, anti-Mormon materials, and I needed to change wards, that's congregations for those who don't know, to solve all my problems, aka sell my house, because you can't just switch wards. You have to move ward boundaries. They won't just let you go to a different ward. So in order to switch wards, you would literally have to move. I was shocked into silence and felt like I was at a bishop's interview versus working with a paid professional. I canceled all of our future appointments and found a new and so much better therapist, but some friends have encouraged me to report the first therapist for inappropriate behavior. Is that a thing? I do know that that's a thing. I can't tell you all the next steps in doing that, but I can tell you that you absolutely should. That is highly unethical and unprofessional and so scary, because there's a lot of people in faith crisis that are needing actual help and therapy. And for someone to claim that they are a safe space for that and then tell you you're reading anti-Mormon materials, which is literally cult speak. Like, can we talk about how cultish that is? Anti-Mormon materials. Like, that's one of the biggest cult red flags to me that there is. And a therapist saying that to you is really bad. That could be so harmful for people who are looking to talk about that sort of stuff too. And I'm really, really sorry that you were met with that. Good on you for canceling future appointments and finding someone better. I can imagine that would be a mindfuck to go to therapy to work through religious trauma and then be told those sorts of things. I would honestly, this is my answer for everything now, sorry. I would get ChatGPT and just say, hey, I want to report a therapist for unethical practices in Utah or Colorado or wherever. And they'll probably just give you a link and tell you exactly what you need to do. So that's what I would do if I were you. But yes, I would report them for sure. I am traveling with a friend in Europe, so we are in close quarters all of the time. I got her watching Secret Lives of Mormon Wives, and she is obsessed, and she now has a ton of questions about Mormonism. But every time I explain something, I can't help but feel embarrassed and stupid for being a part of it in the first place. I studied abroad a couple years ago, and I'm seeing friends here in France, and now I'm the token ex-Mormon that everyone is asking questions. And that's not what I want to be, because it makes me feel crazy. Is anyone else annoyed/triggered or in situations like this? Like, I love to yap with someone who is an ex-Mormon too, but with all of these never Mormons, I can't help but feel labeled now as someone who was crazy enough to have done it. I totally get that feeling, that sentiment. I don't think I've ever felt embarrassed of having been Mormon. And maybe part of this is because I was born and raised Mormon, but I think even if you are a convert to the church, I mean, people talk about this all the time with cults, right? I think there's a stigma that anyone who gets drawn into a cult must be stupid or gullible or naive. And that's really not true. Like, if you look at any cults, like things that people don't even debate are cults, there are really intelligent people who end up being recruited into cults. So I wouldn't look at it as something to be embarrassed by, like you should have been smarter than that. I don't know if you're like me. And again, I don't think that you have to be in order to not feel embarrassed by that. But I literally was raised this way. I think it would be almost crazier if I had been able to see it all for what it was throughout my upbringing, because everyone around me was doing it, because I was being taught to do it, because I was literally indoctrinated into doing it. So I think people find it fascinating mostly for that reason, or in a big way for that reason, because they're like, wait, how are normal people doing this? And the Secret Lives of Mormon Wives thing is really interesting, because I think people are seeing like, wait, there's like normal people who are Mormon, and it's really weird because there's certain things that just, I'm using the word normal, but you know what I mean. I was thinking this because I was listening to a podcast that Whitney Levitt was on from The Secret Lives of Mormon Wives, and she's the most devout Mormon, well, maybe second most, but she considers herself Mormon. She doesn't drink coffee. She wears her garments some of the time. And the interviewers, who are never Mormon, asked her, what's going on with the coffee thing? Like, why can't you drink coffee? And she literally said, I don't know, but I just do it because that's what I've been told to do. And that was so interesting to witness because I realized how many things I used to do just because I was told. And when you're told certain things, this is the way to be happy, this is the way to be healthy, and your parents are saying that, your leaders are saying that, your friends are saying that, it's just like, okay, like, why wouldn't you? And it was weird to watch someone in such a huge spotlight position right now just to be like, yeah, I don't know, I don't get the coffee thing. She said, yeah, that'll be one of the first questions I ask when I get to heaven. It's like, that's crazy to be admitting that you just are doing something because that's what you were told to do and that it doesn't make any sense to you. And it's so nice to now be in a place where I'm not just doing things because I was told to or thinking things because I was told to. But I do think it's really valid to just not want to be the token ex-Mormon and to not want to feel like a circus animal who everyone's like, wow, that's so crazy that you did all of those things. Maybe it's just the attention seeker in me that I haven't found myself disliking that. I kind of love those situations just because I love when people want to hear what I have to say about things. So maybe that's my own attention seeking showing. But I think it's super valid you feel that way, especially around people you haven't seen in a while, and just not wanting to have to like rehash all of that all the time is really valid. Maybe next time you can just kind of, I don't know, just send signals, like just give a short answer, just be like, yeah, like maybe give them my podcast. Plug Girls Camp, plug Mormon stories. Honestly, that could be a good way out, is just being like, yeah, you know, I don't know if you went on a mission, but they're like, a mission, oh my gosh, tell me more. You could be like, actually, like there's some really interesting resources that really get into it. That could be a good way to kind of take the weight off of you and then shift the conversation a little bit. Or you could just give them my number. Hey, actually, my friend really loves talking about this, so why don't you give her a call instead? I have a story that I think you and the campers would be interested in hearing. You have my attention. I grew up as an evangelical Christian, and I was always so invested in my relationship with God, talking to my friends about God and how they could have a relationship with Him too, going to church and youth group, etc. I was invested, and so was my family. The summer going into my senior year of high school, 2 friends of mine tragically and suddenly passed in a plane crash, along with the dad of one of the friends. It was horrific. I really clung to my faith in God, believing that my friends were in heaven gave me so much peace amidst the grief my group of friends and I felt. Shortly after the accident, I'm talking less than a week, I went to church with my parents. As I was leaving church, one of the pastors stopped me to ask how I was doing. I told him that I was feeling so broken, but that thinking about my friends in heaven gave me peace. The pastor proceeds to say, "Your friend was a Mormon, right?" I said, "Yes," like it was a question. Then he said, "Well, your friend is in hell." I simply and firmly said, "I don't believe that." And I walked away. It took everything in my dad to not throat punch the guy. I left feeling gutted. Why in the hell would you say that to anyone, let alone a grieving 17-year-old who is expressing her faith? So mind-blowing. Since then, it's been 8 years. My parents have not stepped foot back in that church. My parents have had conversations with church leadership. They used to be very involved, and they were met with passivity. They have huge issues with those in power at churches and the lack of accountability. I have now found a new church in a new state all these years later where people who are grieving are met with compassion and love. I still have a relationship with Jesus and consider myself a Christian, but I will never forget the ignorance that was shown to me that day. So freaking crazy. That is so crazy. We talked about this a little bit. This seems to be a theme in the funeral episode where I was talking about the Baptist funeral where someone died of an overdose and the whole funeral ended up being about how that person was going to hell, as if that's an appropriate thing to say at someone's funeral. Crazy to me. it does make me grateful is maybe a strong word, but it does make me happy at least that Mormonism isn't that way about heaven and hell, or at least there's some sort of sugarcoating of that. So when someone dies who's not a Mormon, I don't think you would ever be met with that person is in hell. It's also not great, but it would be more like, oh, the Mormon would be thinking, hopefully they accept the true gospel in spirit prison where they currently are. So not all that much better, but the hell thing is so nasty and cruel. That was something that came up a lot in the Dr. Phil episode. I need to shout out Sarah. Sarah, she's on TikTok as @leavingfaith. I will add that to the show notes as well. She's such a badass. She's a professor. She's so smart. She was on the ex-religious side of things on the Dr. Phil episode. And the reason she deconstructed was because her grandpa died and he wasn't, quote, saved. And she realized pretty quickly, wait, I don't want to believe in something that would damn my grandfather to eternal torment just because he didn't believe in Jesus. And so she talks a lot about that on the show. Yeah, I just think that concept of the afterlife gets really awful really quickly. And I'm so sorry that you were met with that as a sweet 17-year-old, to your point, just trying to cling to your faith and trying to rely on your faith the way you should have been able to offer you peace and hope amidst something really awful. And I'm glad you found a place where you feel like you can do that now, and you found a church that better fits. And I also really admire your parents just immediately putting their foot down. I also think that's something, speaking to the cultishness of Mormonism, that's something about Mormonism that Mormons will put up with a lot of garbage in their wards and stuff because it's just not really a choice to like go find a better fit. Where it feels like in evangelical Christianity, it's a little bit more of that. Like you can find a place that feels right to you. And if you want to go worship Jesus in a community, you're able to kind of find the best place to do that. And I think that's a much healthier way than the Mormon way. As that person pointed out, you're not even allowed to switch wards. Like you have to go based on where you live. So I'm glad that you got to do that and that your parents were like, nope, not dealing with that kind of bullshit. Gonna end there for the day. Thank you so much for tuning in. I love Campfire Chats so much. I will make sure that this is a highlight on the Girls Camp Podcast Instagram. So if you want to write in thoughts, feelings, questions, you can do it there. We are on YouTube at Girls Camp Podcast and on TikTok at Haley Rawl. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for listening. And I'm really excited. We've got some good things in store this month. It's spooky month. We're going to be doing spooky religious stories, which I loved doing last year. So stay tuned for that. And I'll talk to you soon. Bye.
GIRLSCAMP, it's Girls Camp.
This has been a 58 Ember production. For more shows, please visit the 58 Ember channel, 58ember.com, or find us at 58 Ember Media on socials.